Africa occupies a unique and foundational position in human history. It is widely recognized as the birthplace of anatomically modern humans and the starting point of all human migration across the globe. Beyond its cultural, linguistic, and ecological richness, Africa is also the most genetically diverse continent on Earth. This genetic diversity is not a minor detail, but a defining feature of humanity itself. Scientific research over the past several decades has consistently shown that African populations contain greater genetic variation than all other populations combined. Understanding why this is the case requires an exploration of evolutionary biology, deep time, environmental adaptation, migration, and population history. This video argues that Africa's unparalleled genetic diversity is the result of its role as the origin of modern humans, its long population history, its environmental complexity, and its extensive patterns of migration and interaction. Recognizing Africa as the most genetically diverse continent challenges outdated racial assumptions and reshapes how humanity understands its shared biological heritage. The primary reason Africa exhibits the highest level of genetic diversity lies in the fact that modern humans originated there. Fossil evidence and genetic studies confirm that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa approximately 300,000 years ago. For tens of thousands of years, human populations lived exclusively on the African continent before any major migration outward occurred. Genetic diversity increases over time as mutations accumulate naturally across generations. Because African populations have existed for the longest continuous period, they have had more time for genetic variation to emerge. In contrast, populations outside Africa are descended from relatively small groups that migrated out of the continent roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago. This migration involved only a subset of the genetic diversity present in Africa, a phenomenon known as the founder effect. As a result, non-African populations carry only a fraction of the total human genetic variation. This means that two individuals from different African populations are often more genetically different from each other than either is from a person of European or Asian descent. Africa does not represent a single genetic lineage, but thousands of deeply rooted lineages shaped by millennia of evolution. Another major contributor to Africa's genetic diversity is the long-term stability and size of its populations. While other regions experienced repeated population bottlenecks due to ice ages, volcanic eruptions, or extreme climatic shifts, many African populations maintained relative continuity. Even when climatic changes occurred, Africa's vast size and ecological variety allowed human groups to relocate rather than face extinction. Large, stable populations preserve genetic variation more effectively than small, isolated ones. Over time, this leads to the retention of rare genetic variants that might otherwise be lost. Africa's population history includes thousands of semi-isolated groups that interacted intermittently, allowing diversity to accumulate without being erased. Furthermore, Africa's long history of settlement contrasts sharply with regions such as the Americas or Australia, which were populated relatively recently. These newer populations have had less time to develop internal genetic diversity, reinforcing Africa's unique position in global genetics. Africa is home to some of the most varied environments on the planet. These include equatorial rainforests, savannas, deserts, high mountain ranges, coastal regions, and tropical islands. Each environment places different selective pressures on human populations, shaping genetic traits related to skin pigmentation, metabolism, immunity, and physical adaptation. For example, skin color variation across Africa reflects adaptation to different levels of ultraviolet radiation. Darker skin evolved in regions with intense sun exposure to protect against DNA damage and folate depletion, while lighter skin tones appeared in regions with lower UV exposure, where vitamin D synthesis became a selective pressure. These adaptations developed independently across multiple populations rather than along a single evolutionary pathway. Similarly, genetic adaptations related to diet and disease illustrate Africa's diversity. Lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, evolved independently in several African pastoralist groups. Resistance to malaria, including traits such as the sickle cell trait, developed in response to endemic disease pressures. These adaptations vary significantly across regions, contributing to Africa's genetic richness. Africa has never been a static continent. Human movement within Africa has been continuous for thousands of years, driven by climate shifts, trade, conflict, and innovation. These migrations did not erase diversity, but often increased it by introducing new genetic combinations. Major historical movements, such as the Bantu expansion, reshaped population distributions across sub Saharan Africa. However, even large scale migrations involved interaction and integration with existing populations rather than complete replacement. As a result, genetic diversity was layered rather than homogenized. Trade networks across the Sahara, the Nile Valley, the Horn of Africa, and the Swahili coast facilitated gene flow between distant regions. These interactions produced complex genetic patterns that defy simplistic racial or regional classifications. Africa's genetic landscape reflects a long history of connection rather than isolation. Africa's extraordinary linguistic diversity mirrors its genetic diversity. The continent is home to more than 2,000 languages, belonging to several major language families. Linguistic boundaries often correspond to long-standing population divisions, offering insight into historical patterns of separation and interaction. Cultural practices such as marriage systems, subsistence strategies, and social organization have also influenced genetic variation. Endogamous communities, where marriage occurs primarily within the group, preserve distinct genetic lineages. At the same time, intermarriage between neighboring groups created genetic bridges across regions. This balance between separation and interaction allowed Africa to maintain high diversity without fragmenting entirely. Genetic studies increasingly integrate linguistic and cultural data to reconstruct population histories, further highlighting Africa's complexity. Challenging the concept of race. One of the most important implications of Africa's genetic diversity is its challenge to the concept of biological race. Traditional racial classifications often group Africans as a single category, despite their vast internal diversity. Modern genetics has shown that such classifications have little scientific basis. Genetic variation does not cluster neatly into racial groups. Instead, it changes gradually across geography, a pattern known as clinal variation. Africa exemplifies this reality more clearly than any other continent. The genetic differences between African populations are often greater than those between Africans and non-Africans. This understanding undermines racist ideologies that rely on simplistic biological distinctions. It reinforces the idea that race is a social construct rather than a biological fact. Africa's genetic diversity reminds humanity that variation is natural, continuous, and shared. Implications for medicine and science. Africa's genetic diversity has profound implications for medical research and global health. Many genetic studies have historically focused on populations of European descent, limiting the applicability of medical findings worldwide. Including African populations improves scientific accuracy and equity. Genetic variants associated with disease risk, drug response, and immunity are often more diverse in African populations. Studying this diversity can lead to better treatments for conditions such as cardiovascular disease, cancer, and infectious diseases. It also helps identify protective genetic traits that could benefit global medicine. Failing to include African genetic diversity not only perpetuates inequality, but also weakens scientific knowledge. Africa is not peripheral to human genetics, but central to it. Africa's genetic diversity is not just an African story. It is the foundation of the global human story. Every human alive today carries genetic lineages that trace back to Africa. The differences seen among populations worldwide represent only a small subset of the diversity that exists on the continent. Recognizing Africa's role reshapes narratives of human history. It places African populations at the center of scientific inquiry rather than at the margins. It also restores historical balance to discussions that have long undervalued African contributions to humanity. This perspective encourages respect for Africa's past and responsibility for its future. Preserving genetic diversity requires protecting communities, cultures, and environments that sustain it. Africa is the most genetically diverse continent because it is the birthplace of modern humans, the longest continuously inhabited region on Earth, and a landscape of extraordinary ecological and cultural variety. Its populations have had more time, space, and opportunity for genetic variation to emerge and persist. Migration, adaptation, and interaction have layered complexity upon complexity, creating a genetic tapestry unmatched anywhere else in the world. Understanding Africa's genetic diversity challenges outdated racial thinking, enriches scientific knowledge, and deepens appreciation for humanity's shared origins. Africa is not a single story, a single look, or a single lineage. It is humanity in its fullest expression. To understand Africa's diversity is to understand ourselves.